You embarrass me just by breathing the same air, Evangeline. Look at yourself! A plain girl with no powerful lineage to offer my rising house.
Your Majesty, I believe you have an opening for a true mate, and I am officially free.
Put that away! You are absolutely nothing without my protection!
Kneel, kneel.
Welcome to Luna's Secret Library. In this special corner, we are dedicated to sharing the most intense, romantic, and captivating love stories. If you're passionate about tales where destiny and justice intertwine, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of our wonderful stories. The crystal chandeliers of the Winter Palace cast sharp, freezing shadows across the marble floor. Evangeline stood near the heavy velvet curtains, her breath catching in her throat. She adjusted the faded silk of her gown, feeling out of place among the glittering high-born wolves. Across the ballroom, her betrothed, Gavin, laughed loudly with his elite inner circle. Clinging to his arm was Tanya, a scarlet-dressed female whose scent of jasmine and malice filled the air. Gavin had completely ignored Evangeline since they arrived, treating her like an unwanted ghost from his past. For months, rumors of their hidden affair had whispered through the Pack territory. Tonight, Gavin chose to bring the scandal into the blinding light of the royal court. The surrounding noblemen watched the trio with cruel amusement, waiting for the inevitable storm to break. Tanya whispered something into Gavin's ear, pointing her manicured finger toward Evangeline's modest corner. Gavin's chest swelled with arrogant pride as he patted Tanya's hand reassuringly. He marched across the polished floor, his heavy silver-toed boots echoing with military precision. His friends followed closely behind, forming a suffocating wall of muscle and judging eyes. Evangeline did not retreat. She lifted her chin, her green eyes flashing with quiet defiance. "You embarrass me by just breathing the same air, Evangeline," Gavin sneered, his voice cutting through the music. "Look at yourself, a plain girl with no powerful lineage to offer my rising house." Tanya giggled from behind him, burying her face in his shoulder to feign modesty. "Gavin, please, we are in public," Evangeline said, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "Do not make a scene out of your own infidelity." The word infidelity struck a nerve, making Gavin's face darken with immediate fury. He needed to prove his loyalty to Tanya and assert his dominance before his powerful peers. Without a single word of warning, his large hand swung through the cold air. The sound of the flesh-on-flesh impact cracked through the grand ballroom like a gunshot. The sharp blow spun Evangeline's head to the side, sending a shock of hot pain through her cheek. Gasps rippled through the gathered crowd as classical music abruptly died down to silence. A bright red handprint quickly bloomed on Evangeline's pale, flawless skin. Tanya smirked, her eyes gleaming with the vicious satisfaction of a victorious predator. "That is for disrespecting the woman I actually love," Gavin declared, wiping his hand on his tunic. He expected tears, screams, or a humiliating retreat into the dark winter night. Instead, the silence in the room grew heavier, suffocating every laugh in the hall. Evangeline slowly turned her face back, tasting a metallic hint of blood on her lip. She did not cry, her gaze was ice, sharper than any silver blade in the kingdom. She looked at Gavin, then at Tanya, and finally at the spineless friends who cheered him on. In that profound quiet, she felt a powerful bond snap, freeing her from years of obligation. She did not look down at the floor in shame. Instead, she turned her back on Gavin with deliberate, agonizing slowness. Her eyes locked onto the raised dais at the far end of the grand chamber. Sitting on the obsidian throne was a shadow that commanded the entire Northern Empire. Alpha King Regis sat with his chin resting on his fist, his dark eyes watching the drama. Regis was the apex predator, a ruler whose very name made Gavin's entire bloodline tremble with fear. He was Gavin's ultimate nemesis, a king who had stripped Gavin's family of their ancient lands. Evangeline began to walk, each step firm and echoing against the stone floor. She did not run away from the humiliation, she walked directly into the center of power. The crowd parted before her like the sea, sensing a dangerous shift in the room's energy. Gavin's arrogant smirk froze on his face as he realized exactly where she was heading. Evangeline! Stop right there! Gavin hissed, taking a step forward to grab her arm. But a sudden, oppressive aura filled the room, freezing Gavin in his tracks like ice. It was the heavy, suffocating pressure of an ancient alpha's dominant will. Regis slowly straightened his spine, his dark eyes tracking Evangeline's unyielding approach. She stopped at the very base of the throne, looking up into the eyes of the monster. The young, beautiful woman stood bleeding before the king, offering him her absolute allegiance. "Your Majesty," Evangeline said, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the silent room. "I believe you have an opening for a true mate, and I am officially free." Up on the dais, the ruthless Alpha King Regis smiled, a terrifying and beautiful sight. The silence in the grand ballroom was so profound that a dropping pin would sound like thunder. Alpha King Regis did not immediately accept her bold declaration. He slowly descended the obsidian steps of the royal dais. His massive frame radiated an ancient, terrifying power that forced the lesser nobles to their knees. Regis stopped mere inches from Evangeline. He tilted her chin up with a single, clawed finger. His crimson eyes searched her green ones for any sign of fear or deceit. "A true mate?" Regis mused, his voice a dark, hypnotic rumble. "Why should I take a broken toy discarded by my weakest enemy?" Behind them, Gavin let out a harsh, nervous laugh of triumph. He stepped forward, mistakenly believing the Alpha King was defending his wounded honor. "You see, Evangeline? You are absolutely nothing without my protection," Gavin sneered. Evangeline did not even spare her former betrothed a backward glance. She kept her unwavering gaze locked entirely on the towering Alpha King. "I am not a discarded toy, Your Majesty," Evangeline stated clearly. "I am the one who just dropped the leash." She reached into the bodice of her faded gown and pulled out an ancient, silver amulet. The moment the relic caught the chandelier's light, terrified gasps echoed through the room. It was the legendary moonstone of the Northern Vanguard. Gavin's arrogant smirk vanished instantly, replaced by sheer, suffocating terror. "Put that away!" Gavin roared, completely forgetting his place as he lunged toward her. Regis did not even look at the charging fool. The Alpha King simply flicked his wrist. A shockwave of raw dominant energy slammed into Gavin. Gavin was thrown backward, crashing brutally into a heavy table of crystal glasses. Tanya screamed and scrambled away from the shattered ruins. "Speak, little wolf," Regis commanded, his eyes completely captivated by the silver amulet. "Everyone believes Gavin built his fortress through his own military genius," Evangeline declared. "They are entirely wrong. The Northern Passes answer only to the bloodline of the First Vanguard. I am the last living descendant of that ancient line. Gavin's power was merely leased to him through our betrothal. Tonight, by striking me and parading his mistress, he severed that sacred pact." She stepped closer to Regis, closing the remaining distance between them. "I am not here to beg for a strong husband to fight my petty battles. I am offering you the absolute, legal control of the northern borders. I propose an alliance of sovereigns, not a fragile marriage of convenience. I do not want simple revenge, I want to build a new world order. Gavin is not my broken heart, he is simply an expired contract." Regis let out a low, dangerous laugh that vibrated through the stone floors. This was no weeping girl seeking a dramatic rescue from a toxic lover. This was a master tactician handing him the keys to total continental domination. She was completely rewriting the rules of the werewolf hierarchy. "You are a very dangerous creature, Evangeline," Regis whispered, a genuine smile touching his lips. "I accept your terms, Vanguard." He took her small, scarred hand in his massive one. He raised it to his lips and kissed her knuckles with profound, theatrical respect. From his pile of broken glass, Gavin watched his entire empire crumble into dust. Gavin scrambled out of the shattered crystal with his fine clothes torn and dripping with spilled wine. Panic and profound humiliation twisted his handsome face into a grotesque mask of feral desperation. He pointed a trembling, blooded finger directly at Evangeline. "It is a forgery!" Gavin screamed, his voice cracking violently under the oppressive silence of the hall. "She is a weak, rankless female who stole that relic from my family's secure vault. By ancient pack law, an unwed female cannot command the Northern Vanguard armies." He lunged forward again, his sharp claws fully extending as he prepared to physically rip the amulet from her neck. The surrounding nobles held their breath, expecting the Alpha King to instantly annihilate the disgraced lord. Instead, Regis slowly stepped back, a dangerous glint of anticipation flashing in his crimson eyes. He was not a heroic savior rushing blindly to protect a helpless maiden. He wanted to see if the last Vanguard descendant could truly defend her own territorial crown. Evangeline did not flinch as Gavin's massive, aggressive frame barreled rapidly toward her. She did not cower behind the towering presence of the Northern Empire's supreme ruler. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second and gripped the silver moonstone tightly. A dormant, ancient power violently awakened within the deep currents of her veins. It was not the brute physical strength of a frontline warrior, but the absolute, crushing authority of the first commanders. Evangeline opened her eyes, revealing pupils that now glowed with an ethereal, blinding silver light. "Kneel," she commanded, her voice no longer a human whisper but a resonant, pack-binding decree. The single word carried a heavy, ancestral weight that bypassed logic and struck directly at the wolf's soul. Gavin's physical momentum shattered entirely as his knees slammed brutally into the cold marble floor. He clawed frantically at his own throat, suffocating under the invisible, crushing gravity of her sudden dominance. The elite royal guards stationed around the perimeter simultaneously dropped to one knee in involuntary submission. They recognized the authentic, undeniable frequency of the true Northern commander. Evangeline looked down at her former betrothed, her expression completely devoid of pity or vindictive rage. "You were only a temporary placeholder, Gavin," she stated coldly, the silver light slowly fading from her piercing gaze. "The armies never truly belonged to you, they were merely waiting in silence for my command." Tanya, who had been trembling near the ruined table, suddenly realized the absolute finality of Gavin's ruin. The ambitious mistress quickly backed away from her fallen lover, her terrified eyes darting nervously toward the grand exit. "I had absolutely no idea," Tanya stammered loudly, desperately trying to distance herself from the disgraced lord. "He lied to me about his noble title and his wealth, I swear it." Gavin let out a pathetic, broken howl of despair, realizing his new lover was already abandoning his sinking ship. Evangeline ignored the pathetic, cowardly display of the mistress entirely. She turned her back on her past and faced Regis, who was watching her with an expression of profound, dark admiration. "The northern borders are now fully secured under my rightful name," she told the sovereign. "Let us proceed immediately to the war room to map out the future of our new empire." The heavy iron doors of the royal war room slammed shut, sealing them in absolute privacy. Torches lined the stone walls, casting flickering light over a massive, carved wooden map of the empire. Regis walked to the head of the long table, his presence dominating the confined space. Evangeline followed smoothly, showing no signs of the emotional trauma she had endured earlier. 3 of the king's highest-ranking generals were already waiting in the deep shadows. They glared at the young woman, their scarred expressions hardening with visible disrespect. Your Majesty, why is a disgraced female permitted in the strategic sanctum? General Thorne growled. She is no ordinary female, Thorne, Regis replied, his voice dark and commanding. She is the true vanguard, and she now holds the absolute key to the northern passes. The generals exchanged incredulous looks, clearly doubting this sudden shift in power. Gavin's forces have held those passes for a decade, a second commander argued stubbornly. Evangeline stepped up to the edge of the carved map, resting her fingertips on the wooden terrain. Gavin only held them because my bloodline allowed the defensive wards to remain active, she corrected firmly. He fundamentally misunderstood the geography, leaving the eastern gorge completely exposed to rogue packs. She picked up a heavy silver marker and slammed it down on a vulnerable valley. If the southern rebels marched through here tonight, your entire flank would be slaughtered by dawn. Thorne sneered, slamming his heavily armored fist onto the oak table. Do not lecture us on warfare, little girl. Before Thorne could take another breath, Regis's hand shot out, grabbing the general by the throat. The Alpha King lifted the massive warrior entirely off the ground with terrifying ease. You will address the Lady Vanguard with the exact same respect you show me, Regis whispered lethally. He dropped the gasping general back to the stone floor, his crimson eyes flashing with lethal warning. Evangeline did not flinch at the sudden display of extreme violence. She simply continued tracing the strategic supply lines on the map. Gavin's father will not accept this loss of status peacefully, Evangeline warned, looking up at the king. He has heavily fortified the Winter Keep, and his loyalists control the region's main silver supply. Then we will rip the keep apart stone by stone, Regis stated, a feral grin spreading across his face. I need you to lower the ancient wards protecting their central fortress. I can disable their magical defenses, but it requires a blood ritual near the stronghold's perimeter, she explained. Regis moved closer, his towering frame casting a protective shadow over her. Then we ride north before the sun rises, side by side. Suddenly, frantic knocking echoed violently against the heavy iron doors. A blooded scout stumbled into the war room, collapsing onto his knees. Your Majesty, the scout gasped, coughing up dark blood onto the floor. Lord Gavin's loyalists have just ambushed the northern gate, and they have taken prisoners. Evangeline's green eyes narrowed into dangerous, calculating slits. The war for the north had officially begun. The freezing wind howled across the desolate plains as the royal cavalry approached the Winter Keep. Dawn had not yet broken, leaving the towering stone fortress shrouded in absolute, terrifying darkness. Alpha King Regis rode at the vanguard on a massive warhorse, with Evangeline mounted securely beside him. High upon the fortified battlements, Gavin stood safely behind a shimmering, translucent magical barrier. He held a trembling, tearful civilian hostage by the throat, pressing a silver blade against her pale skin. Halt your advance immediately, or I will paint these ancient walls with innocent blood. Gavin's frantic voice echoed. He desperately believed his magical shields were entirely impenetrable against even the strongest werewolf army. He thought using hostages would force the honorable Alpha King to retreat in a humiliating, public defeat. Regis did not halt his black stallion, his glowing red eyes fixed purely on the pathetic, desperate traitor. Evangeline smoothly dismounted her horse, her heavy boots crunching softly against the blood-stained snow. She walked confidently toward the glowing edge of the barrier, completely ignoring Gavin's unhinged threats. You cannot breach this shield, Evangeline. Gavin screamed, his rising panic leaking through his false bravado. My family has reinforced these wards with absolute dark magic for 10 consecutive years. Evangeline stopped a mere inch from the humming energy field, looking up at him with cold, terrifying pity. You reinforced a lock without ever realizing I am the only living key, she stated calmly. She drew a ceremonial silver dagger from her belt and slashed it swiftly across her own left palm. Bright, ruby-red blood welled up from the deep cut, glowing with a faint, ethereal silver aura. She knelt with profound grace and pressed her bleeding hand firmly against the frozen, unforgiving earth. The moment her pure vanguard blood touched the dormant runestone buried beneath the snow, the ground violently shook. A massive pulse of blinding silver light erupted outward, tracing ancient, forgotten geometric patterns across the battlefield. Gavin's so-called impenetrable magical barrier flickered, groaned, and then shattered like cheap, fragile glass. The deafening sound of the magical explosion knocked Gavin and his cowardly loyalists completely off their feet. The civilian hostages scrambled rapidly away from their captors in the ensuing chaos, safely slipping into the shadows. A monstrous, blood-chilling roar ripped through the freezing dawn air, shaking the very foundations of the ancient keep. Regis had abandoned his human form entirely, shifting into a colossal, terrifyingly beautiful midnight black wolf. His fur was thicker than armor, and his crimson eyes burned with the promise of absolute, merciless slaughter. The Alpha King leaped over the ruined gates with a single, physics-defying bound, landing directly among the terrified rebels. The royal army charged immediately behind their monstrous king, flooding into the courtyard like an unstoppable ocean of steel. Evangeline stood up slowly, wrapping her bleeding hand in a clean cloth while watching the swift, brutal execution of justice. She had just physically dismantled Gavin's last remaining illusion of power with a single drop of her ancestral blood. Up on the collapsing battlements, Gavin crawled backward in absolute terror as the giant black wolf slowly approached him. The courtyard of the Winter Keep was completely bathed in the chaotic glow of burning siege torches. Alpha King Regis, still in his monstrous midnight wolf form, stalked slowly toward the collapsing battlements. Every massive paw strike against the stone resonated with the terrifying weight of his absolute authority. Gavin was backed entirely against the freezing stone wall, his expensive armor dented and heavily covered in soot. He held up his trembling, blooded hands in a pathetic, desperate gesture of absolute surrender. "Mercy, Your Majesty, I beg of you." Gavin screamed, his voice breaking into a pathetic, high-pitched sob. "My father will pay any ransom, in pure silver or territory, to spare my miserable life." The giant black wolf did not growl or snap, he merely stared down with crimson eyes full of lethal contempt. Regis was deliberately waiting for the true commander of the North to deliver the final, irreversible verdict. Evangeline walked gracefully up the crumbling stone stairs, her posture perfectly straight despite the freezing wind. The elite royal guards parted immediately for her, lowering their silver-tipped spears in silent, absolute reverence. She stopped directly beside the towering Alpha King, placing her uninjured hand gently against his thick, dark fur. The monstrous beast actively leaned into her gentle touch, a clear, shocking display of submission to his chosen equal. Gavin stared at the surreal sight in absolute horror, realizing his former fiancée had truly tamed the apex predator. "There is no ransom large enough to buy back your broken honor, Gavin," Evangeline stated, her voice echoing in the cold air. "You enthusiastically sold out the northern borders to impress a mistress who abandoned you at the first sign of danger." Gavin fell heavily to his bruised knees, crawling pathetically toward her leather boots and weeping like a broken child. "Evangeline, please, we were betrothed since we were innocent children," he pleaded miserably, clinging to the past. "You cannot just erase our long history. You used to look at me with such unwavering devotion." She looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound, hollow disgust for the creature he had become. "The naive girl who looked at you with devotion died the exact moment you struck her in front of the royal court," she replied coldly. She reached down without hesitation and ripped the silver crescent insignia roughly from the collar of his ruined tunic. "By the ancient, undeniable right of the First Vanguard, I strip you of your noble rank, your stolen title, and your pack alignment. You are hereby legally declared a rogue, exiled entirely from these sacred lands until the end of your miserable days." The heavy, final word rogue struck Gavin exponentially harder than any physical blow ever could. To be branded a rogue in the harsh, unforgiving northern winters was an absolute, agonizing death sentence. Regis let out a deafening, earth-shattering howl that officially sealed the unyielding, magical decree of exile. The remaining rebel forces dropped their weapons instantly, surrendering fully to the new, undeniable Queen of the North. The intense fires of the magical siege slowly died down, leaving the winter keep covered in a thick, suffocating layer of grey ash. Dawn finally broke across the frozen horizon, casting a pale, victorious golden light over the conquered northern fortress. The scattered loyalists of the disgraced lord had completely surrendered their remaining weapons to the advancing royal army. Evangeline stood entirely alone on the highest stone balcony, watching the dawn illuminate the sprawling territory that was finally hers. She felt a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute peace entirely replacing the years of quiet humiliation she had endured. Behind her, the heavy wooden doors creaked open with a deep, echoing groan that broke the morning silence. Alpha King Regis stepped onto the frost-covered balcony, fully restored to his imposing, incredibly muscular human form. He wore a dark velvet cloak draped casually over his broad shoulders, his crimson eyes noticeably softer than they had been during the slaughter. He did not approach her with the arrogant, entitled swagger of a conqueror arriving to claim his battle spoils. Instead, he walked with the measured, deeply respectful steps of a sovereign approaching his absolute equal. The northern passes are entirely secure, and the newly branded rogue has been forcefully escorted beyond the territorial borders, Regis informed her quietly. Evangeline turned to face the towering king, the freezing wind whipping her dark hair around her pale, flawlessly beautiful face. You have my eternal gratitude for standing fiercely by my side during this bloody transition of power, Your Majesty, she replied with genuine sincerity. Regis shook his head slowly, stepping close enough for her to physically feel the immense, radiating heat of his dominant aura. I did not stand by your side out of charity, pity, or mere political convenience, Evangeline, he stated, his voice a mesmerizing, low rumble. I watched you completely tear down a corrupt, deeply entrenched empire with nothing but your sharp intellect and your ancient blood. You are undeniably the most dangerous and magnificent creature I have ever encountered in all my centuries of violent rule. He reached out slowly, his large, calloused hand gently and reverently tracing the sharp, elegant line of her delicate jaw. Evangeline did not pull away, she met his intense, burning gaze without a single, flickering trace of female submission. I told you in the royal court that I was only offering a strict military alliance of independent sovereigns, she reminded him, her breath creating white clouds in the biting cold air. An alliance is merely a fragile piece of paper that can be easily burned or rewritten by ambitious future generations, Regis countered smoothly. I want something far deeper, older, and entirely unbreakable to permanently bind the wild north and the central capital together. He slowly dropped to one knee on the freezing stone floor, bowing his proud head before the newly minted Queen of the North. It was a genuinely shocking, historically unprecedented gesture of profound vulnerability from the most feared apex predator on the entire continent. I am officially asking for the ancient, sacred mate bond, not as your commanding superior, but as your fiercely devoted equal, Regis declared with absolute conviction. Rule this entire vast empire by my side, Evangeline, and let us forge a dark dynasty that will fundamentally terrify the gods themselves. Evangeline looked down at the kneeling king, her chest tightening with a fierce, undeniable surge of ultimate triumph. She reached out and rested her scarred hand gently on his thick dark hair, fully accepting the monumental surrender of the Alpha King. The unforgiving northern wasteland was a brutal, endless expanse of jagged ice and blinding snow. Gavin stumbled through the freezing drifts, his expensive leather boots completely destroyed by the harsh terrain. Without the protective, deeply rooted heat of a pack bond, the biting wind cut directly into his weakened bones. He dragged his frostbitten feet forward, his former aristocratic pride utterly crushed by raw, primal survival instinct. Trailing a few paces behind him was Tanya, shivering violently beneath a stolen, moth-eaten wool blanket. Her vibrant scarlet dress, once a symbol of her seductive triumph, was now reduced to filthy, frozen rags. The malicious, arrogant charm she once wielded had vanished entirely, replaced by deep, ugly lines of exhaustion and bitter resentment. "This is entirely your fault, you pathetic excuse for a dominant male," Tanya shrieked, her voice hoarse and raw from the cold. "You promised me absolute power and endless wealth, but you could not even hold on to your own designated mate." Gavin did not have the physical energy or the mental willpower to strike back at her relentless, venomous accusations. Every painful, agonizing step he took was haunted by the cold, unyielding memory of Evangeline's fierce emerald eyes. He remembered how she used to quietly mend his political mistakes and silently patch up his glaring military blunders. He had foolishly mistaken her profound, ancestral restraint for weakness, deliberately discarding a priceless diamond to pick up a worthless stone. The poisonous, sickening realization of his own monumental stupidity burned hotter than the freezing wind tearing at his face. Suddenly, Tanya let out a terrified, choking gasp and collapsed entirely onto the frozen tundra, pointing a trembling finger toward the sky. Gavin lifted his heavy head, his hollow, defeated eyes widening in absolute, paralyzing disbelief. High above the distant winter keep, the pitch-black night sky was violently torn apart by a miraculous celestial event. A towering pillar of blinding, ethereal silver light shot upward, piercing the heavy storm clouds with sacred authority. Seconds later, a terrifyingly beautiful surge of dark crimson energy twisted upward to meet the pure silver beam. The two ancient, primordial forces collided in the heavens, weaving together in a breathtaking display of supreme dominance. It was the legendary, unmistakable visual manifestation of a high-tier mate bond being officially sealed by the gods. A physical shockwave of pure, resonant magic rolled rapidly across the barren plains, carrying the undeniable scent of the Alpha King and the Vanguard. Every single wolf across the entire continent, from the highest noble to the lowest rogue, felt the immediate shift in the cosmic hierarchy. Gavin felt the overwhelming, crushing pressure of their combined authority force him violently to his bleeding knees. He stared up at the magnificent, swirling colors illuminating the sky, realizing the absolute finality of his profound loss. Evangeline was no longer merely a lost fiancée or a discarded tool, she was now an untouchable goddess ruling alongside the ultimate apex predator. She and Regis were actively forging a terrifying dynasty that would be remembered in absolute or for thousands of centuries. He had literally held the keys to the entire empire in his hands, only to throw them away for a fleeting moment of cheap, meaningless validation. Tanya began to sob hysterically into the snow, fully realizing she was permanently chained to a broken, powerless outcast who would soon freeze to death. Gavin did not comfort her. He simply tilted his head back and released a hoarse, agonizing howl of pure, devastating regret. His pathetic, broken cry was instantly swallowed by the howling wind, completely ignored by the vast, uncaring wilderness. The grand cathedral of the central capital was breathtakingly adorned with 10,000 violently burning silver candles. Every elite noble leader from the continent's four corners had gathered inside in absolute, breathless silence. They had not traveled for a simple wedding, they had come to witness the official crowning of the Vanguard Queen. Evangeline walked slowly and purposefully down the long velvet aisle, her midnight blue gown gracefully sweeping the polished marble floor. She wore no traditional white veil of submission, keeping her incredibly beautiful face fully exposed to the scrutinizing eyes of the Empire. Alpha King Regis stood patiently at the grand altar, waiting for her with a profound, terrifying devotion radiating from his crimson eyes. He wore the ancient obsidian crown of the supreme ruler, his towering frame exuding the ultimate, undeniable authority of the apex predator. As Evangeline finally approached the altar, Regis deliberately stepped down from the elevated dais to meet her on completely equal ground. He did not simply take her hand in marriage, he presented her with the legendary, fiercely glowing silver diadem of the North. You came to me with nothing but a shattered betrothal and a publicly humiliated pride, Regis declared, his mesmerizing voice echoing loudly off the high-vaulted ceilings. Tonight, you stand before the entire known world as the undeniable, brilliant architect of our new, eternal dynasty. He gently placed the ancient silver crown upon her dark hair, officially sealing their sacred, unbreakable mate bond before the watchful gods. The intense, primordial magic of their combined sovereign union violently surged through the heavy cathedral walls like a massive tidal wave. The sheer, overwhelming pressure of their coupled dominance physically forced every single werewolf in the room directly to their knees. They bowed their heads not out of forced legal obligation, but out of absolute, bone-deep reverence for their true, terrifying rulers. Evangeline looked out at the vast sea of kneeling alphas, calmly reflecting on the brutal, bloody journey that had brought her to this exact pinnacle of power. She thought briefly of Gavin, the arrogant, foolish boy who had publicly slapped her face just to impress a fleeting, cowardly mistress. He was now nothing more than a forgotten, frozen skeleton buried permanently beneath the unforgiving, brutal northern snowdrifts. He had foolishly tried to completely extinguish her inner light, completely unaware that she was destined to command the blinding sun itself. She had stubbornly refused to cry, refused to desperately beg for scraps, and ultimately refused to be a tragic footnote in his pathetic, short-lived story. Instead, she had walked directly toward her most dangerous enemy and fundamentally rewritten the rigid laws of their entire universe. Regis wrapped his incredibly strong, protective arm firmly around her waist, pulling her close against his broad, heavily armored chest. Are you completely satisfied with the dark, magnificent empire we have brutally built from the ashes, my beautiful queen? He whispered intimately against her ear. Evangeline smiled, a sharp, breathtakingly dangerous expression that promised thousands of years of absolute, unchallenged dominance. This is only the very beginning of our reign, my ruthless king, she replied calmly, her green eyes shining with infinite, world-conquering ambition. The immensely heavy iron doors of the grand cathedral suddenly burst wide open, letting the bright, golden sunlight of a brand new era violently flood the sacred hall. The pathetic era of the weak, the cowardly, and the arrogant men was permanently and violently over. The legendary, unstoppable reign of the Vanguard Queen and her Alpha King had officially begun.